Today we find ourselves truly at a crossroads, at the end of a cycle that has already lasted too long. Indeed, the so-called world economy is unraveling, but what even is the world economy? The entirety of the modern economic worldview of today is very much foreign to our people's natural way of seeing the world, as it originates from those that could be regarded as forces of progress, a Trojan horse which we have so kindly let in many generations ago. But in order to understand what the world economy truly is, we have to look at its creator's specialty, usury. As per the modern, widely circulating definition, usury represents the action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest, keyword being unreasonable. But that leaves us with the question, what is a reasonable rate of interest? A great question indeed, a question that, if we have to ask, we are already treading dangerous waters. In order to provide an answer, we have to consider a key factor that pertains to all modern monetary systems, that being inflation. I'm certain I don't have to say what inflation is, but perhaps it would be helpful if I were to say what inflation isn't. A great misconception amongst the majority of the population is that inflation is caused by governments printing money. That is not even remotely true. So what causes inflation then? First of all, governments cannot print money. Matter of fact, governments don't even have enough money to cover their own basic functioning more often than not. Money is printed by the central bank of a given nation, the so-called national bank, in quotation marks, because these institutions are always independent. What that means in practice is that the national bank's decisions are its own and are not subject to the will of the people. A follow-up question naturally arises. Who owns these banks? That I may not directly answer. Instead, I will go into a little history. In 1492 Spain, the monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile passed new legislation that led many wealthy citizens to emigrate, with many choosing the Netherlands as their new home, as a result of the much more open attitude of the Dutch, bringing their capital, expertise, and practices with them. These well-off immigrants were primarily the ones who led the creation of what today we call capitalism. This was done through a combination of practices that we are all too familiar with today. To give some examples, many of these immigrants became goldsmiths that would practice an early form of fractional reserve banking. They would take gold for safekeeping, giving a promissory note, later known as a banknote, which was an IOU to the depositor. They would, however, not just give notes in value to the gold that they had, but 10 times as many, charging interest, commonly in the double digits, for these IOUs. They would then take the notes they received as interest, buy more gold, which had a real intrinsic value, and use it as a reserve to create many more such notes, and repeat. Others would invest their money into different ventures, such as new businesses, maritime expeditions, and trade, lots and lots of trade, with one of the most, if not the most profitable, being the slave trade, at which some of these immigrants did particularly excel at. These large amounts of capital that were extracted, both from the exploitation of locals and foreigners alike, which were often then loaned to the government, led to the growing influence of the Dutch Empire, especially after the creation of the Dutch East India Company, which has been regarded as the largest corporation in all of history, being publicly traded, owned in large part by these same now settled immigrants. All this, however, led Dutch Empire to become the so-called world hegemon, the most powerful empire in the world by the 17th century. Another very profitable venture that these early venture capitalists particularly liked was war, which was used by states to acquire the riches of other nations, with part of those riches going to pay the interest on the loans to the private bankers. And in 1642 England, when the English Civil War began between the forces of the Royalists and those of the Parliamentarians, led by none other than Oliver Cromwell, the Amsterdam-based bankers offered massive support to Cromwell in exchange for allowing large amounts of these wealthy immigrants to move into England, which the English did not allow, and of course to practice usury there. By 1648, with the massive financial support from abroad, Oliver Cromwell defeated the English monarch Charles I and publicly executed him after a mock trial the next year. By 1656, the old prohibitory laws began to be disregarded, and despite massive opposition from practically everyone in the nation, with the Council of State declaring that these migrants, quote, would be a grave menace to the state and the Christian religion, end quote, many began to come from the Netherlands, usually in a conspicuous fashion. In 1658, Cromwell died. However, his legacy remained, and even though he was a great asset to these foreign bankers, he posed one small issue: his lack of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. His son Richard succeeded him, but only ruled for 9 months, and so in 1660 the son of King Charles I, Charles II, became king. But make no mistake, the immigrants were here to stay, and their influence was only to grow from here. See, Charles I was defeated. Charles II did not rule freely, as his father had. He now had to be in good relations with the funders of his predecessor, Cromwell. As such, in 1663, he passed the so-called Act for the Encouragement of Trade, by which the, quote, export of all foreign coins or bullion, gold or silver, free of interdict, regulation, or duties of any kind, end quote, was to be allowed. 3 years later, he passed the so-called Act for the Encouragement of Coinage, through which private persons, the goldsmiths and bankers, were allowed to mint the coins of the nation at the royal mint, pocketing the difference between the cost to produce and the higher face value of the coins. This was a much more practical way of profiting from coinage compared to the archaic, ancestral method of clipping them. That is the reason why coins, which historically were the main form of currency, have ridges, by the way. In 1685, he was succeeded by his brother, James II, that was rather unpopular with the Dutch, that began a ruthless propaganda campaign against his rule by printing and widely distributing libelous pamphlets. Luckily for them, his rule only lasted for 3 years, as William of Orange, a Dutch prince, with the financial support of Amsterdam bankers, went on to conquer England, replacing the ruling monarch with a more favorable, to the interest of the bankers, ruler over England, again. In exchange for this well-needed support, now William III, that began his rule in 1689, after 5 years in power, decreed the creation of the Bank of England, the very first privately owned national bank. The newly created bank then sold shares worth £1.2 million to private investors, which, unsurprisingly, were all bought up within the very first day. To put this number into some perspective, as of the moment of writing, an ounce of gold is worth $3,300, and £1 was roughly equal to a quarter ounce of gold. That would mean, in total, the Bank of England was valued at 300,000 ounces of gold, today worth just under $1 billion. Seems rather a bargain. But these are actually later prices, from 1717 more precisely, after 23 years of operation, when Isaac Newton set the gold price as the master of the mint. Gold is rather overvalued today anyway, as roughly 1 part of gold is equal to nearly 100 parts of silver, while the historic average was 1 to 15. Originally, a pound meant just that, 1 pound of silver. It was a Tower pound, a little lighter than the modern pound, roughly 350 grams, of 92.5% pure silver. So roughly 320 grams of pure silver, or 11.3 ounces. At current spot prices, $36 per ounce, leads to 1 pound in 1694 being worth roughly $400 in today's silver. However, in gold, as there was a set standard of conversion of 1 to 15 gold to silver, that leaves us with 0.75 ounces per pound in 1694, equal to just about $2,500 today. Going off the gold valuation, the Bank of England costed investors $3,025,000 to acquire. We can also deduct that in 23 short years, the currency was devalued by 2/3. In other words, a paper pound in 1717 had 1/3 of the purchasing power of the same pound at the time of the creation of the Bank of England. That means that the monetary supply, which was predominantly gold and silver before the creation of the bank, tripled by 1717, with the vast majority of that increase coming from paper, so-called money. In these short 23 years, something else also happened. A new financial concept became the new standard for England, the so-called national debt, as the creation of the Private Bank of England had as its purpose the lending of paper money, backed only in small part by gold, to the national government, in the beginning specifically for the purposes of war. The national debt went from zero, before the creation of the bank, to £50 million in 1717, equivalent to over $40 billion today. In other words, the private bankers that acquired the ownership of the bank for £1.2 million had in 23 years created and loaned the government 50 million paper pounds, which the government pumped into the economy, stimulating short-term growth at the expense, however, of the aforementioned inflation. Indeed, this was the first time England experienced inflation ever since the late Roman period, and again, in just over 2 decades, the pound had devalued by nearly 70%, while the wages of the people increased much more slowly, if at all, as a large part of the population had a fixed income. The prices of goods rapidly increased, and the rate of poverty with them. This also led to a significant widening of the wealth gap within the nation, as those who were able to secure lucrative government contracts, usually friends and associates of the bankers, many with a foreign background, became extremely rich, while the primarily native population became poorer and poorer. And the money that was lent was not free. The government had to pay 8% interest per year, which would compound over time to astronomical sums, which were then used to acquire gold and create more paper currency. Within the first 2 years, there were 1.75 million paper pounds in circulation, backed by only £36,000 worth of gold. In other words, the bank loaned out 50 times more money than it actually had. And as the debt only grew, the government, which always needed more money, had to further borrow to cover all debts and pay the interest, leading to exponential debt growth, or in other words, the exponential transfer of public funds to the accounts of private bankers. But the government still had to service the debt, to at least pay the interest on all their loans, and they had to be secured by something. That was the labor of the people of the nation through taxation. As the government produces nothing, it needs to take its money from somewhere else. That was either from its own population, through ever-increasing taxes. As the interest is compounding, it ever increases itself, or of course from foreign wars, exploiting the resources of others to pay off the bankers. Thus, the government of England, as the perpetual borrower, became slave to the lender, the foreign bankers, that were now in charge of its very own money supply, and as such, they had to acquire more money to pay the bankers at any cost. That meant being forced to wage wars, establish colonies, and always increase taxation. As a small parenthesis, this was also the real reason for the American Revolution, as after the passing of the Currency Act of 1764, they were forced to use and borrow paper pounds issued by the Bank of England, being thus forced to pay interest to the central bankers and losing the control over their own money supply and thus of their economic independence. As the British Empire was becoming well established, the Dutch bankers started moving their funds to the most profitable ventures that were now in England. Couple that with the monopoly they had on the money supply of the young empire, and England became the base for world banking. It would be so for the next 2.5 centuries. By the early 20th century, however, the British Empire was on the decline. Despite its military dominance over so many nations, over so many resources, the treasury was broke. As the largest part of the wealth the British Empire stole from other nations, through all the very costly wars, was siphoned away by the perpetual and ever-growing interest that had to be paid to the private bank. To put it into perspective, the British government owned the private bank £650 million in 1914. 5 years later, that had increased to £7.5 billion, more than tenfold. And despite all the apparent wealth of the nation, and despite, or perhaps in part because of industrialization, England for the average man was far from a merry place. In the future, I will address the path of the decline also, but for now, we will focus on the rising of the new empire. After Britain, and through its empire, a third of the world's land was milked for all it had, the bankers decided they needed a new host, and that host was to be America.